Hello, everyone. This video is going to be a short overview of the history of educational measurement, especially educational measurement, over the last 200 years. Time passes in Western civilization. If you want to, you can go all the way back to the Chinese, but we're not going to. And Chinese a long time ago, but we're not going to. You can look up that online if you choose. And what you're going to see is a lot of faces, particularly white men, up until fairly recently, and quotation, things that they said. I'm not going to focus on the accomplishments of any particular individual. Occasionally, I'll mention something that's particularly interesting. But what I want you to get is a sense of change in attitudes and perspectives and perceptions of what the world needs. And so that's how we're going to start to understand how we got to where we are now. So a good starting place is Sir Francis Galton, who you can see was born almost 200 years ago. I can't believe that. I feel like I know the man. But the Sir Francis Galton arguably is the start of it all. He was definitely an obsessive compulsive. And one of the things that he was particularly obsessed with was counting. And he was, for one thing, the inventor of the fingerprint method of detection. He also came up with the correlation coefficient and generally had his hand in everything that could possibly have to do with measuring individual traits. And hence is an extremely important name, even though you won't find his name associated with any modern tests. He kind of shared responsibility, although I don't believe they knew each other, with a researcher in, I believe, Germany named Wilhelm Wundt. And he is often Wundt considered to be the inventor of experimental psychology. Its relevance to the field of measurement is that you can't measure the effect of experiments that are supposed to change or understand psychological features unless you somehow or other can measure those features. And the thing I like about this, he says, we speak of virtue, honor, reason, but our thought does not translate any one of these concepts into a substance. And measurement is all about translating concepts into substances or things that are tangible, accessible through behaviors or observations. We're going to move on now to Charles Spearman. Charles Spearman, you could say, is responsible for modern correlational methods, which are essential to measurement. And you see that while he was incredibly interested in the experimental method, I believe he may have studied with Wilhelm Wundt, but you'd have to look that up yourself because sometimes my understanding of these people overlaps. But he stated that you can't truly be scientific in the full sense of the word unless you can measure them. In other words, he put into words what Wilhelm Wundt understood was that our big concepts of things like honor were not accessible to manipulation or growth in understanding unless through quantification. All these people are quantifiers. So through experimentation or quantification, unless you had a way of converting those concepts to numbers through measurement. Now we move on to Edward L. Thorndike. Edward L. Thorndike is responsible for a lot of things. The one I associate, well, I just will not claim anything. He created various tests that are still in use. His name is engraved on the outside of Teachers College, Columbia. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. If a thing exists, let's say honor, empathy, it exists in some amount, which varies among people. There must be relative amounts of it. And if it exists in some amount, it can be measured. And a point that I note in this quote is, if you take what's known as in logic as the contrapositive, which is a logically equivalent statement of an if-then statement, what he said is, if it cannot be measured, it doesn't exist. So here you see someone for whom measurement was clearly had primacy. Edward L. Thorndike was, disclaimer here or no excuse, a proponent of eugenics. And there were a lot of proponents of eugenics associated with psychology and measurement. The idea that understanding of human characteristics and experimentation with human characteristics could eventually lead to improvement, and that those improvements might involve, frankly, eradicating characteristics that were non-desirable. Now, Thorndike was a proponent, but I believe to anyone's knowledge, never joined an organization or attempted to put those beliefs into action. We get now to some of the people with a more extreme reputation for the eugenics movement, and that would be Yerkes or Yerkes, and the next person we'll see. And one thing, I'm not going to say much about him, except that he was very important. He was very important for the development of what are known as the Army A and the Army B tests, which were used for sorting people in World Wars. I can't remember whether this included World War I, but certainly in World War II. So is World War I because it goes back to 1917, into categories for different roles. Infantry, for instance, is where you would put illiterates and people of lower intelligence. The Army A eventually evolved into something that eventually evolved into our contemporary SAT. It was very different from our contemporary SAT. It's back in the days when the SAT emphasized itself as a test of intelligence. And you can see from this quote that he was motivated by the need of the United States and defense and military service and duty, and therefore efficiency. This resulted in some way in an almost military attitude towards race theory, and was probably detrimental to the advancement of minorities, probably particularly Black Americans, at the time of the early 20th century. So I make, this is a place where we were. There is this whole early 20th century up to about the mid 20th century through the war period where measurement was used for some ugly purposes. And we need to understand that and also where it's moved since then. Lewis Madison Terman also had a eugenics orientation. And you note from this idea of forecasting that these people had the concept that traits were innate, and we talked a little bit about the heritability of traits. And this was a very fixed idea of people in this time. This was a big time for the measurement of intelligence and the belief that intelligence was what it was all about. And that those characteristics and many characteristics of people were fixed, were not malleable, and therefore you could predict there was no emphasis at this time on cultural characteristics or the effects of culture or learning or environment on people's life tracks. It was very deterministic. And then you get some people who start to look a little bit beyond that, who are in fact Thurstone. You can see from his picture, he must have been a good guy. Took a different view. He was interested in values and not the individual idea of an individual's valuing, which might be determined by various traits that might be innate, but social values, which starts us thinking about social norms, about social norms within groups. And as he said, this starts to go into social psychology, and society or the field of measurement was not ready for that. But he's a voice that was looking ahead. And then you get to Lindquist, who's definitely, although he doesn't in this statement talk about social psychology, and I don't think he had really the same view, nonetheless, he aspired to systems of testing that didn't treat individuals as groups of people who had fixed traits, treated individuals as people with individual differences, which might be affected by highly individualized characteristics and probably multiple characteristics, so that the world of whether they were innate traits or whether they were learnable characteristics was so complex. He's talking about complexity rather than simplicity in ways that the more deterministic, positivist people who precede him did not. And then we get to Ralph Tyler. And you may have heard of Ralph Tyler because he was extremely important in education and in developing ideas about the importance of instructional objectives. He's huge in that area. And really, he was interested in school learning. And so he talks about the learner and using assessment to help people. And this is something that none of the people whose voices we've heard before in their quotes, that the field moved into after the wars. It's a post-war perspective, is and it's a later 20th century perspective, is the helping approach and the developmental approach rather than the sorting approach, the classifying and the ranking and the sorting that was predominant in prior years. And then you have Anne Anastasi, our first woman, and probably the first, certainly prominent woman in educational measurement. Psychological, actually more, but measurement in general. And here you have the word cultural, the thought of contexts and experiences that not just any test will do, and that you have to understand how the test is acting and interacting with people in a situation to know essentially whether it's valid. And the idea of validity in terms of youth and in terms of society, that previously had been, again, this ranking, grouping, classifying, and it has become, by Anastasi's point, and she helped make it so, much more sensitive to culture and needs. I'm a big fan of Frederick Lord. He made a lot of innovations in statistical approaches to testing. And he was a little bit skeptical about educational testing, which he was not the first to be. But he often, through the use of humor, pointed this out and was very careful about the limits of test use and test interpretation and error of measurement, that the results of a test might be wrong for a variety of reasons, most of them random, many of them random, not necessarily all of them random, although I think that he was interested in random error, but how random error could affect the judgments made based on tests. And there you start to hint at questions of fairness. Lee Cronbach, I'm sure you've heard of Cronbach's alpha. Cronbach, we will probably, no, you already read Cronbach and Meas. All these people who started, of this generation, who started to become skeptics, were still proponents. These are the post-positivists, which is essentially what I am. These are the people who said, no, not everything about everything is innate, is fixed, is categorizable, can be clumped and used for the purposes of the mass social benefit. But we sympathize with, we feel empathy or sympathy that these things could be useful. And their performance is not equivalent to a psychological construct. They can be different, but they are different. But we seek to understand those things, both their differences and what is the nature of the constructs that we talk about in that very loose way pointed out 100 years ago by the people we started. Okay, so still the sympathy with seeking understanding of honor, values, and so on through measurement, but the understanding that it isn't that simple. Don Campbell, huge, and this is actually called Campbell's Law. And in a research methods class, you will probably have read Campbell's work on experimental and quasi-experimental design and on the validity of inferences from social science research. What he said about measurement, and this is Campbell's law, is the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. So I'm sure you can all just think of our accountability tests in these terms, and there's no way to even paraphrase what Campbell said because he said it so perfectly. We get to Jane Levenger. Jane Levenger is not much taught. She was a psychologist, but she did some very important work in measurement. And she's hard to read, frankly, which is perhaps part of the reason why she isn't taught more. But I've always been very fond of this statement from, I believe, in 1957. It's quite an old paper, that the person who is best able to respond in a test situation in a warm and friendly manner is not necessarily the warmest and friendly person. It's conceivable that there are traits where the capacity to simulate them indicates their absence. And you think of sociopaths. You think of people who can lie outright and pass any lie detector test because that's the nature of their sickness. And it's an interesting idea because, again, it upends our ideas of the quality of the interpretations that can sometimes be gleaned from our tests. Just like Lord was highly interested in random error, this is more systematic error. And systematic error leads the field to think about bias, and thinking about bias leads us to think about fairness. And those people who start to talk about social values also go into fairness. And now we start to see the development of more contemporary views, even though I believe this paper was written in the late 50s. Now, Lee Sechrist was one of my dissertation advisors and a wonderful man, just a wonderful man. And he's known probably more by his students than by his works, although he was one of the authors of a very famous work sometimes it's called non-reactive measures in the social sciences, and sometimes it's called unobtrusive measures, which is the idea of measuring things by traces that they leave in the world, as opposed to outright on-demand behaviors that people exhibit on a test. So, for instance, alcoholic relapse by, rather than asking people how much they drink, which might be a case of Jane Levenger's point, where the more people drink, the less honest they are about it after a relapse. The examining people's garbage for bottles as an unobtrusive measure of alcoholic relapse. And again, like other people, the tests, he had the idea that sometimes test use could detract from the quality of information. He also said something that I find compelling, is that nothing in statistics or research methodology requires you to do something stupid. And I suggest you remember, if nothing else, that one. Samuel Messick wrote what one of my advisors used to call the Bible of educational research, at least one chapter in the Bible. And what I'll point out to you in this is that he summarized a lot of what had recently gone before in saying that test validation, the assessment of the quality of a test, includes the evaluation of its meaning and consequences, the results of its use. The meaning goes back to, are we measuring the construct? But putting into words the idea of the consequences of test use was huge. Now, Cronbach had done this years before, but it was Messick who created a framework that emphasized the importance of consequences of test use very strongly. And that has been, and still is to some extent, a question of great debate, but it is a question that seriously makes people in educational measurement attend to issues of bias, fairness, social value. Campbell's law about are tests actually going to be used in corrupting ways, and puts together all of these things. I don't know if we're going to read Messick this semester. Messick, like Levenger, is hard to read, and other people have probably put his perspectives better, but he often shows up on one of my reading lists. Robert Lynn, like Sechrist, died just recently and is much missed. You can again tell from some of these people's pictures what friendly people they are. And again, you know, disparate impact on minority students will undermine the system and demonstrate a failure. I mean, my guess is that you all nod your heads at this. I believe, well, certainly among the quotes that we've seen, disparate impact, this is the first time. This has to do with what Messick talked about with consequences of test use. And Robert Lynn was a prominent opponent of state accountability tests for certain uses, including teacher evaluation. I can't remember what he wrote about school promotion, but probably that as well. He was not a proponent of the use of tests for policy purposes. Laurie Shepard is still alive and is quite a wonderful woman, as you perhaps can see from her smile. And fending off the negative effects of externally imposed tests, she has been a major opponent of external testing. And although she accepts it as a reality, but she has come to put, as it were, all her eggs of hope in the basket of classroom assessment and improving teacher practice so as to help teachers teach students and help students learn despite policies that might make that difficult. And she has been very influential in moving the foremost organization for educational measurement, the National Council on Measurement and Education, towards a serious level of attention to classroom assessment. I think that's probably my last person, but I will leave that on the grounds of hope. Hope because she's still alive, she's still active, and she has learned from all of what went before, as we all will as the next generation of teachers, specialists in measurement, instructional leaders, or consumers of tests, because there certainly are a lot of them and they will be wherever we go.